Michael, welcome to A Business School.
Pleasure.
RyanAir competes in a very tough industry. What do you do to keep growing, looking at your competitors fail, such as Spanair and other companies which go to bankruptcy, while RyanAir keeps growing and growing and growing? What is the key of the success of RyanAir?
Well, it is a tough industry in that there's a lot of people don't survive in it, and it's salutary to remember that airlines have lost more shareholder value than any other sector of industrial activity since publicly quoted companies started doing business in the early part of the last century. And even more than the dot-coms or anybody else, airlines have lost more shareholder value for their shareholders. That's primarily because their shareholders were well down the priority list in terms of the motives for which the company did business. Labour took precedence over them. Aerospace manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus took out most of the profit, as did airports. And passengers took their place well ahead of shareholders. And invariably shareholders were governments in Europe or public authorities in the US, or a variety of different reasons people got into the airline business, but none of them were to make profit. RyanAir is one of the few airlines for whom the shareholder takes precedence over everybody else. And we run the business obviously safely. We run it to appeal to passengers, and we're the fastest growing, most popular airline in Europe, so we must be doing something right in that regard, but fundamentally we're in this business to make a profit. So when you start with that position, and everybody else doesn't start with that position, it's not difficult to succeed relative to others. Then the question is, how do you build a business for yourself, which is what we do. Essentially, we're not in competition with anybody. A majority of our routes are monopolies. They were never flown by anybody else. They never will be flown by anybody else because they're a function of the low fare that we offer. So, for example, via the Lid to Charleroi, for example, near Brussels, is a route that only RyanAir flies, only RyanAir has ever flown, and only RyanAir will ever fly. So the task for us is an internal task, really. It's to get our costs always to a level that will allow us to offer a fare to generate sufficient demand that in turn is profitable for us on a sustainable basis. And that's an ever-increasing challenge because, of course, fuel is increasing as a price that we really can't control. To give you an example, when I joined RyanAir, fuel was 9% of revenue. This year it's 45% of revenue. So the big challenge is to get costs down elsewhere, and that's the way we run our business. It's the only activity we involve ourselves in, is to reduce costs. Because our business is essentially a commodity business upon which the customer expresses his preference by reference to the cost of the product, not anything else. Safety is a sine qua non, and a variety of other, we're the most punctual airline, we have the newest aircraft, we have the least cancellations, the least lost bags. Not because the consumer likes that, but because that's the cheapest way of doing business. It costs money to be late, it costs money to lose bags, and it costs money to cancel flights. So we do it less than anybody else because we set out to do our business in the lowest cost way. And then that helps us to actually offer and prevail in a business where essentially the customer is saying, we want to buy at the cheapest level. We're the only people who can now offer the cheapest fares. And because we've concentrated on cost reduction, we can do it profitably on a sustainable basis.
What is amazing is that, it seems like you compete you have a community business, but at the same time, it seems that you have been able to create your own market.
Essentially, yes, because the good news about our business, if you reduce the costs, the demand is elastic. And essentially, as we reduce the cost, the demand increases, provided we reduce fares, obviously. If you look at, for example, the greatest example of that is the Dublin-London route. Historically, Spanish people have lived with this error that Madrid-Barcelona was the largest route in Europe. In fact, it's not. Dublin-London is the biggest route, was the biggest route in London, or in Europe, I'm sorry. But for 25, 30 years prior to RyanAir's arrival on the route, there were 1 million passengers on that route every year. No increase. The only thing that went up were the fares. Remarkably went up by about 12 to 15% every year. On the same day, Aer Lingus and British Airways remarkably came to the same decision to increase the fares by the same amount each year. Enter RyanAir. The cheapest fare, by the way, in November 1985 was about £270 with no availability. 1985, RyanAir came into business. By 2004, when the lowest fare was about €25, or less than a tenth of the fare in 1985, the passenger traffic had increased to 4.8 million passengers, making it the busiest international route in the world and the second busiest route in the world after Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong Taipei is an international route. But it has since declined because of taxation measures taken in both Britain and Ireland, and also the high cost of airport in Dublin, particularly, and also in London. So we have reduced the capacity, and so has Aer Lingus, etc. But fundamentally, it's the greatest single example of how demand can be generated simply by reducing the price. The only analogy is that, essentially, where I remember old landlines prior to mobile phones, where the service was appalling and the cost was huge, and the level of activity was very, very small. Now, for texting, obviously, in many cases it's free, but even for calls, it's very cheap. The unit revenue that companies derive from their customers is a fraction of what the old landline companies used to derive. But the activity has exploded so much, the demand elasticity has worked so well, that the total revenue is now a multiple in hundreds of times of the revenue that the old landline companies got, the total revenue they got from their activity. So it's the closest analogy I can find to air travel. Of course, air travel, like telephone companies, the same shareholder profile, you know, owned by governments in the main, and poor service levels, and no interest. And you know, owning phones was quite a privilege. Now it's a very democratic thing, much like air travel. So you had this massive pent-up demand, and you still have it in most countries. Spain, like Britain and Ireland, are the most, Britain in particular, is the most saturated, well, not saturated is the wrong word, but it has the highest concentration of low-fare activity in the aviation business. In part a legacy of its old charter business that's dying now, but also EasyJet, Jet2, Monarch, and ourselves, and BMI Baby, are based there largely, initially at least. In our case, we're bigger now elsewhere. We're bigger in Spain than we were in Britain now. But you have, pro rata to the population, far more based aircraft, far more seat capacity emanating and arriving into that country than any other country in Europe. But it's still not full. Nor is Spain. Spain has had this massive explosion. We have grown from 3 million passengers in Spain about 7 years ago to 38 million passengers in 2012.
In fact, you're the leader.
And we are merely scratching the surface of the potential in this market. Believe me. Nobody believes that until we do it again. I said that when we had 6 million passengers, and now we're at 38. We're going to talk to the Minister of Tourism tomorrow with a project to deliver another 20 million passengers over the next 4 years. He has to do certain things for us, which, on balance, and my experience with Spanish politicians, he's highly unlikely to do, but nonetheless, the potential is there. So it is a wonderful business to be involved in. We have 11% of the total intra-European market, and that means 89% of the people who travel within Europe pay fares that are at least, if they have the privilege of travelling with EasyJet, 40% higher than ours. And if they go with people like the late lamented Spanair or Vueling, they pay twice as much. And travel with Iberia, they pay probably 3 times as much as we do. So the potential for us to expand that market, that 89% of the market that we don't have at the moment, to maybe twice its current level, or maybe 3 times its current level by reducing the fares, it's immense. And it shows you the potential we have to grow this business.
Last question. Have you ever considered to compete in other markets, such as South America,
No.
North America?
There isn't the liberal regime on air travel that you have in Europe, in any other market that we're aware of at the moment. Like if you're a United States-based airline, and United States-owned, they're very rigorous and tough ownership. Like you must, non-US citizens cannot own more than 25% of a US airline. The US has the same open skies regime, but in Europe it is the freest market that we know of on the planet.
Michael, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Let's go.